My name is Flair Donglai, and I'm currently teaching at Shanghai Jiao Tong University in the School of Humanities. This is a series of public seminars I'm hosting under the name of Transnational and Situated. You can find more information about the seminar series via the channels behind me, Facebook, WeChat, and there will be more events next year. This is the 5th event this year and the last event, the concluding event. And we have had a very fruitful year, and I sincerely thank all the speakers who participated in the series before. And I apologize because I am still recovering from a very bad flu, so my voice is a little bit more mellow than usual. Please excuse that. So today we're really honored to have Professor Chris Berry from King's College London to talk to us. And I think Chris needs no introduction for anyone who is interested in the study of Chinese cinema. He is really a monumental figure in the field. He has worked on numerous topics and published numerous works. He also had practical experience working with the Film Import and Export Corporation in Beijing in the 80s, and later served as one of the final judges for the Golden Horse Awards in Taiwan. So many practical as well as academic experiences. I think for today, he will share with us this latest research on North Korean films and its circulation in China. This research is going to be published in the Handbook of North Korean Film by Bloomsbury sometime next year. And please watch out for more details if you want to read on. So after this first part of the talk, which will last for around 45 minutes, we will then enter the Q&A, where you can directly ask Chris questions by raising your hand, and we will unmute you, or you can type your questions in the chat box and I will read them out for you. So without further ado, let's welcome Chris to deliver his talk. Thank you so much, Chris. Oh, and thank you Andong for helping me navigate the APP, the Tencent meetings. And Andong was supervised by Chris at KCL, and he just passed his Viva. Congratulations. And thank you so much for both of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Flair, and thank you, Andong. Excuse me, I didn't know I had a frog in my throat. So I'm just going to share screen with the PowerPoint first of all. So bear with me while I'm having problems getting the slide. Here we are. Okay. Hopefully we'll be all right now. In 2016, I published an essay, as you can see here, in Journal of Chinese Cinemas, and it was called Sino-Korean Screen Connections Towards a History in Fragments. As was mentioned in Donglai's introduction, most of my work is on the cinemas of what we might call the Sinosphere, or the Chinese cultural and political world. But I've also done some work on Korean film. And in this essay that was published a few years ago, I was responding to the work of a colleague and friend, Kim So-young, and her efforts to understand Korean cinema, not so much in the traditional national cinema framework, but rather as transnational and transborder. So I wanted to think about how we could understand Sino-Korean cinema connections. And I argued that because of the very complex political history of both the Sinitic world and the Korean world in the 20th century, with territorial divisions, wars, and so forth, this history really only consisted of fragmented episodes. It wasn't continuous, coherent, and integrated. For example, Koreans fleeing Japanese colonialism worked in the Shanghai film industry. Did you know, for example, that this guy who you can see here, this handsome gentleman, Jin Yan, China's biggest film star of the 1930s, was in fact Korean. His name in Korean would be Kim Yeon. For myself today, what I'm going to talk about is perhaps one of the largest and least well understood of those fragments of the Chinese-Korean screen connections. And that is the screening of North Korean films in China from 1949 to the 1980s. One of the other points that I made in my earlier essay was that it's impossible to do this kind of transborder work without a lot of assistance because it involves different languages, publications that are scattered in different places, and films that are not always easy to find. So before I go any further, I do want to acknowledge the many friends who've helped me with the research that I'm going to present to you now. There are too many for me to name today, but they will be acknowledged in the book chapter that comes out in that handbook of North Korean cinema that was mentioned in the introduction. This work on North Korean films, in terms of where do we situate it, we can say that it's intended to contribute to our rethinking of Chinese cinema during the Mao era. It's over 30 years now since Andrew Hickson called for a change in how we think about national cinema. He argued that instead of thinking about national cinema only as films produced in that country by people from that country for audiences in that country, he argued instead of that, we should think about national cinema in terms of consumption. What films did people in that country watch, including foreign films? And it's in that spirit that I want to think about the North Korean films that were shown and consumed in China in the Mao era and into the 1980s. In that way, this presentation joins other work that is emerging now quite strongly on exhibition culture in China, including Li Jie's work on traveling projection teams and Zhou Chenshu's recent book, Cinema Off Screen. Now today, I'm not really going to talk about reception, about how audiences responded to these films, but rather I'm going to focus more on the bringing of the films into China and the logic that governed that. So it's a bit more of a political economy presentation, I guess. Other scholarship has also made us aware that the People's Republic of China was actually never closed to foreign films, not even during the Cultural Revolution decade, 1966 to 1976. In his book on that period, Paul Clark has pointed out that many of the films shown in China, even during the Cultural Revolution decade, were in fact foreign films, as many as 50%. And everyone in China was seeing foreign films as well as domestically produced films. However, of course, those foreign films were not coming from the West and its allies. This was the Cold War era, and so most of the foreign films that were shown in China were from other socialist countries. Some work has already been done on Soviet films shown in China, especially by Tina Mai Chen. But so far, much less work has been done on the screening of North Korean films in China. And as you can see, this poster is a poster for the very famous Soviet film, Quietly Flows the Don, or the part one of it, at any rate, which was screened in China. So today I want to sort of fill the gap a bit more around other kinds of films than Soviet films, and in particular, looking at North Korean films. I want to begin the process by asking, what information can we put together about the North Korean films that were screened in China between 1949 and the mid-80s? And how should we understand the logic behind the screening of those films? So two questions, if you like. Just what factual information can we find out? It's not necessarily that straightforward. And then what can we figure out about why those films screened, how they screened, and so on? In practice, details about foreign films shown in China are harder to find than information about Chinese films screened in China. I guess that shouldn't be a surprise. China film yearbooks give very precise details about Chinese films made every year and released in China, but much less information about foreign films. They have a little bit, but not a lot of detail. Behind this, of course, is that way of thinking about national cinema that I mentioned earlier. A production-based model where Chinese cinema means films made in China. But as I already mentioned with reference to Andrew Higson, the challenge now is to move or to expand that model into one that also includes consumption and to research China's national cinema culture as one that includes the foreign films that Chinese audiences watched. Now, after quite a long time, I did manage to find a very useful book by Zhang Zicheng. And this is, you can see the cover image here. So a foreign feature filmography. And it covers the period that I'm interested in, detailing all the 1,518 dramatic feature films that were circulated in China by the Chinese State Monopoly Distribution and Exhibition Corporation between 1949 and 1992. It only leaves out a few feature films that were shown in special events like film weeks, but then not subsequently distributed and shown in regular movie theaters throughout the country. You know, most of those films that came in film weeks, like, I don't know, the Romanian Film Week, etc., the East German Film Week, most of them did go into the movie theaters, but some didn't. And the ones that didn't are not included in his filmography. Of those films, 118 are from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, as we know it colloquially. Interestingly, that makes it the second most important source of foreign films in China from the establishment of the People's Republic until the 1990s. The Soviet Union takes the top spot and the USA comes third, as you can see from the slide. But it's important to recognize that in the Soviet case, no films were brought in after 1964. And even then, only one film came in at that point. As I think you know, at first, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China was extremely close, but there was a split after Stalin's death. The Soviets repudiated Stalin, but Mao never did. And so he accused the Soviet Union of what he called revisionism. And so there was a Soviet-Chinese split at the end of the 1950s. And this gap continued from 1964, when the last film was imported, until 1983, when one more Soviet film screened. There was, as for the USA, the record's even spottier. There was one film in 1960, one in 1976, and then a more regular stream began in 1979. Now I have a table that shows the imports, or the bringing in, I should say, of North Korean films. And what it demonstrates, I'm just going to show it in a moment, is that North Korea is the only consistent source of foreign films during this period. So here we are from 1949 through to 1992. you can see there are some years where there are no films, other years where there are as many as 9, but films keep being brought in from North Korea, whereas in the case of the Soviet Union, they stopped more or less in 1964 and don't pick up again for 20 years. And there's very little coming in from the USA until the 1980s. The way the table looks makes it look quite dramatic, but actually in terms of peaks and falls, but the numbers are quite small, so we shouldn't get overly excited about, a shift from 3 to 5 or from 7 to 2. As you'll notice, the early years of the Cultural Revolution, when there was so much disarray in China, is the period when it more or less comes to a stop. And the periods which mark 10-year anniversaries of the establishment of relations between the two countries seem to be a consistent high point on this graph. In addition to feature films, I mean, this is just talking about dramatic features, we must remember also that newsreel films and documentaries from North Korea were also being shown in this period. The other era that you can see here that's fairly strong is the early 1960s. There's a bit of a drop in 1961, and I think that might be because of the lack of resources following the failure of the Great Leap Forward in China and the famine that followed. But the growth in the early 1960s, when you look at 62, 63, 64, is almost certainly because after the Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s, both the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union wanted North Korea to be on their side, to be their ally. And so cultural exchange was one of the ways in which China was wooing North Korea and trying to persuade it to come over onto the Chinese side. Of course, the North Koreans never committed and played off the Soviet Union and the People's Republic throughout this period. Now, unfortunately, none of the Chinese sources, including that Zhang Zicheng book that I just mentioned, give the original Korean title for the DPRK films screened in the PRC. So when people ask me, what were you doing during the lockdown, the COVID lockdowns in the UK? The answer is I was spending an awful lot of time online trying to track down the original Korean titles for all of the 118 films that were screened in the PRC between 49 and 92. I've been able to do that. It's been quite tricky. It's involved, I mean, we could talk about how it was done later on, but it involved quite a lot of exchanges with people who helped me to find these titles. And later on, after I finish talking, if I remember, I will actually drop this appendix table into the chat so that if any of you have a special interest, in North Korean films, and you'd like to know what the original titles were in Korean for all of them, you'll be able to see that. Many of these films still circulate on Chinese television and streaming video services, and they're marketed usually as red classics and under titles like that. Since I did this work and began talking about it, I've discovered that many scholars of North Korean cinema are very excited to know that North Korean films that they cannot find easily from North Korea itself can be viewed on Chinese television. The only problem for them is because they're dubbed in Chinese, they need to find somebody who can translate it into a language, either Korean or English, that they can understand. Now, as well as trying to figure out which North Korean films were screened in China, I've also been trying to understand the logic governing this process. At the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 2022, the idea was emphasized that China has reached a point where it can develop autonomously and in its own way. Of course, this doesn't mean going back to the Mao era, but I think it does mean that we need to understand the liberal market economy, which has been operating since the 1990s, earlier in fact, but emphasized after Deng's southern trip in 1992. We need to emphasize that that liberal market economy is not a force of nature. It's not something to be taken for granted. And it's just one option for organizing an economy and a society. That doesn't mean to say that I think we should idealize other practices either. They've all got their pros and cons and their problems. But we need to ask, what was the logic that was driving this process of bringing these films in from North Korea? So let's step back from our contemporary assumption that cinema is an entertainment industry and that it was commercial. In other words, tickets are sold to meet demand and make profits. And instead, let's try to understand the priorities driving the cinema during the socialist command economy era, which was from 49 through into the late 70s, early 80s. I and many other people have written about how the Chinese cinema in the Mao era operated according to what we could call a pedagogical logic rather than entertainment. In other words, it operated in accordance with Mao's instructions at the 1942 Yan'an Talks on Literature and Art, and those instructions were to prioritize politics and political communication above all else. Huge investments went into making cinema available to audiences all across the country, often with outdoor screenings and mobile projection teams, such as you're seeing here in this little image. The idea was not to try and maximize the box office or revenue, but rather to get the party's message out. Of course, revenue was important to make it possible to conduct this operation, but the point was to communicate what the government wanted communicated to the people. And we have to remember that, of course, television was not important in this era. Radio, yes, through loudspeakers all over the place in public spaces, that was also very important. Now, of course, it's true that these North Korean films did meet the pedagogical goals of the party. They were often on familiar themes, like fighting Japanese imperialism in the bad old days, building revolution, and cooperation during what we know as the Korean War, and what is known in China as the war to resist American aggression and to aid Korea. Also, the presence of these films on China's screens communicated that China was not alone in the world. The sources of foreign films communicated to audiences who China's friends were. So, you can observe shifts even within the Mao era in terms of where the films were coming from that suggest shifts in foreign policy. But of course, the one consistent foreign policy in terms of friendship was the effort to preserve and maintain a friendship with North Korea. But pedagogy alone, this idea of getting the government message out, is not the only reason why these foreign films were shown, or the logic behind their circulation. The command economy of the Mao era was also a shortage economy. In other words, it was assumed that there was demand for all kinds of material things, and the challenge was to meet demand. The economy operated with 5-year plans, and the plans always set goals for more production, more higher targets with every year. So the emphasis in the case of cinema was to build not only a distribution and exhibition infrastructure, so that audience numbers and numbers of screens would go up every year, but also to increase supply as quickly as possible. And in the face of difficulties in increasing the production of local films, of course, foreign films could help fulfill that aim of having more titles in circulation every year. By showing foreign films, increased claims could be made about meeting the targets for increased numbers of titles available. This image is of a VCD box, if some of you know what a VCD is, a kind of low quality DVD, because maybe I shouldn't even assume people know what a DVD is anymore. Anyhow, these were released in around 2000, I think. And there was as you can see, a set of classical films of Korea, or meaning from North Korea, that was released in this period. Now, in terms of, secondly, in terms of the logic of bringing in these foreign films, it should not be understood in terms of imports and exports. And I've been trying, it's very natural for us to talk about imports and exports. I've been trying not to use that language, and rather try to use the language of exchange. And let me now try and explain a bit why. Imports and exports, that's the terminology of commercial trade and profit seeking, which the PRC did not adopt, as I mentioned, until the late 80s at least. Indeed, when you go into publications from the Mao era that discuss relations between different countries and China, the rhetoric of import and export is quite rare. Indeed, instead, what you find in reports, such as those in China film yearbooks that came out every year, published by the China Film Press, is talk about exchange, 交流. And this word, rather than exports and imports, appears again and again in the titles of articles and sections about the international circulation of films, Chinese films going outside China, and foreign films coming into China. This logic of exchange, rather than commerce and trading for profit, governed the period when the DPRK was a consistent source of foreign films for the PRC. What is exchange? Two factors stand out immediately. One, formal reciprocity, and two, the role of the state. The two countries followed their initial cultural interactions by signing formal agreements on cultural cooperation, 文化, they're called 文化合作协定, and they signed these in 1953 and again in 1959. And these were then followed by annual or biannual plans for the implementation of cultural exchange, 文化交流. Now, there is a history of cultural exchange published in China. And when you look at this book, what you discover is a sort of reciprocity that governs all this. The book details the delegation that goes to Pyongyang in 1 year, and it immediately follows that by detailing the delegation that came back from Pyongyang the following year. Same with the films. A film week was sent to Pyongyang. Sure enough, in the next paragraph, it will talk about the North Korean film week that was sent back to China, and so on. In these accounts of cinematic cultural exchange during the command economy era, film weeks, 电影周, are more prominent than discussions of films released into regular movie theaters, although we definitely know that many films were released into regular movie theaters. As Maran notes, quote, film weeks connoted bilateralism and reciprocity, reinforcing the identity of togetherness within the socialist bloc during the Cold War. The first North Korean Film Week in the PRC was held as early as December 1950, and it included the first ever North Korean dramatic feature, My Hometown. And they continued throughout the period that I've been looking at. As I mentioned, for each North Korean film coming to China, a Chinese one went back. Maran analyzes the Film Week as a socialist variant of the film festival, as we speak of it today. She contrasts the way that international film festivals are organized in the West according to, quote, a working calendar that capitalized on such factors as the cycle of film production and the ideal tourist holiday season, end quote, with the scheduling of, quote, film weeks by a calendar that earmarked anniversaries, end quote. And indeed, this pattern characterizes the North Korean film weeks that were held in China. In 1958, the film week marked the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In 1960, it marked the 15th anniversary of Korean liberation from Japanese colonialism. In 1962, it marked the first anniversary of the China-DPRK Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance Agreement. And in 1963, it marked the 15th anniversary of the founding of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And in 1965, it marked the 15th anniversary of Korean liberation, and so on and so on. Sorry, that should be the 20th anniversary of Korean liberation. So here again, a kind of pedagogy is part of the logic, but so is diplomacy and state-to-state relations. Now, the market and the pursuit of profit can be understood as a kind of configuration of power. Just because socialist states didn't operate market economies doesn't mean that they were power-free. Instead, the configuration of power is different. These states operate in the name of the people, the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But the people are also understood as composed of specific classes, with the Communist Party of China and the Workers' Party of Korea as the vanguard organizations that lead the people. In other words, in a command economy, the whole economy is shaped and disciplined by the policies of the party leadership. And this can be seen quite evidently in a recent case study published in the Hong Kong-based Chinese language journal, 21st Century. In this essay, the history of a film that was never released, effectively a banned film, called Li Shanzi, is given in careful detail. What I want to argue is that this history given in this article by Zhang Jishun, this history confirms the crucial role of central party politics in shaping the international circulation of film among the socialist nations. Li Shanzi was based on a North Korean stage play and film called The Red Agitator, or alternatively, The Red Propagandist. In his study of foreign films, screened in Henan province and based on an internal listing of all the films screened in that province, a Nebu document that he got his hands on, Paul Clark notes that a surprisingly large number of prints of The Red Agitator were shown, many more than was the case for other North Korean films. The new research published in the Zhangji Shun article reveals that its North Korean original, The Red Agitator, was handpicked by Premier Zhou Enlai, and he led the drive to produce a local adaptation of it. Initially, this project was part of the effort to woo North Korea onto the Chinese side after the Sino-Soviet split that I mentioned earlier. Considerable resources were spent sending the filmmakers to North Korea to research the film, to meet the directors of the film, people who acted in it, and so forth. But as time went on, the tide turned against the project. This had nothing to do with issues of the market or whether the audience would like the film or not. Instead, everything was determined by diplomacy, internal politics, and state-to-state relations. First, it became obvious that North Korea was playing China and the Soviet Union off against each other and aiming to get what it could out of both of them. And so the prospect of winning North Korea over from the Soviet Union dimmed. Second, the filmmakers involved, and you can see here Zhang Ruifeng played the lead role in this image on the slide. The filmmakers were from Shanghai, and although they were in favor in the early 1960s, politically they fell out of favor as the political tide moved towards the Cultural Revolution. Finally, people began to worry about how the North Koreans would receive the Chinese version of the film. And they began to worry, what if the North Koreans felt the Chinese had got something wrong? So, or even worse, would they be offended if the Chinese film turned out to have either mistakes or to be better than the North Korean film? So they got people in China got anxious that this film that was intended to improve North Korean-Chinese relations might accidentally damage them. And so the film was shelved and never screened. So in conclusion, what I've tried to do today is show to you that the screening of North Korean films in China is an important fragment among the various elements making up that fragmented history of Sino-Korean cinematic relations. It helps us to understand the trans-border dimensions of both North Korean and Chinese cinema cultures during the Cold War era and the connections between them. It challenges the perhaps excessive focus on the relationship between China and the Soviet Union and between North Korea and the Soviet Union. We need to remember the third side of that triangle. And furthermore, the logic of socialist exchange under the command economy system reminds us that alternative dispositions to the profit drive and the market economy are possible, at the same time as it cautions us not to idealize them, because we see how power was in fact very centralized under that system. But I acknowledge, finally, I want to emphasize that I'm only dipping my toes, dipping my toes into what is clearly quite a big topic with this presentation. I haven't discussed the reception of North Korean films in China, either in the past or today, when they continue to circulate in their dubbed into Chinese forms on streaming platforms. And I hope to be able to investigate that a bit more in the future. But that's as far as I've got to go.